I constantly talk about morality. Morality is something of an obsession of mine. And all who are obsessed with morality are condemned to one day ponder the incest question. Is incest immoral? To give a short answer, I haven't decided yet. Once I would have confidently said no, but in recent times I have begun to question that position. The debate over the morality of incest is massively useful. It is in many respects a reprehensible debate. Argue for the controversial side and people will hate you. But it is a debate with immense value. It is of immense value because it really gets people rationally thinking about what it means for something to be immoral. It gets people thinking about morality in a rational way. As an advocate of a rational approach to morality, I obviously like this. This debate makes people come up with arguments. It makes them consider morality. Niche moral issues can be very useful for encouraging people to flesh out their moral systems and engage in critical thinking and rational consideration. The incest debate also perfectly reveals the idiocy that plagues common moral thought. The main three arguments that people use over and over again for incest being immoral are the appeal to disgust, appeal to majority, and eugenics. Let us take a moment to look at each of these moronic arguments. The appeal to disgust. The appeal to disgust is about as bad as it gets when it comes to rational moral arguments. You finding something gross is not a sufficiently rational reason for labelling it as immoral. There has to be a rational reason for calling things immoral. Deeply emotional reasons, such as the disgust reflex, are not sufficient. Gross and immoral are not the same thing. It is probable that you do at least a few things which I find gross. That is not a sufficient case for me to label you as an immoral person, although according to your moronic logic it is. As soon as morality is dictated by the deeply arbitrary emotional irrationality of the disgust reflex, it loses any semblance of seriousness or rationality. Many life-saving medical operations are beyond revolting. Does that make them immoral? I don't think so. If disgust informs morality, then morality is a worthless joke, which differs with the emotion of every individual. I sympathise greatly with the idea that incest is gross, but I also find a great deal of non-ancestral sex to be gross. That doesn't make it immoral. The appeal to the majority. The appeal to the majority is an obviously idiotic argument, but in times of desperation, it is the best friend of the irrational. Many a time have I heard it argued that incest is immoral because people think it is. This is the essence of the appeal to the majority. The moral idea is true because people believe it is true. This is not only a fallacious appeal to the majority, it is circular logic. Why should we believe that incest is immoral? Because we believe that incest is immoral. The logic is blatantly circular. The majority can believe anything and everything. There is no moral belief that the majority cannot conceivably hold. This idea of a majority-moulded morality is beyond idiotic. It is irrational and stupid. Morality should be based on rationality, usefulness, and desirability, not majority opinion. Morality should progress to serve our interests. It should not be tied to majority opinion. The natural conclusion of such a thing is morality never changing or progressing. Why would society progress its moral views if the fact that society held them necessitated their validity? The appeal to the majority is beyond stupid. Eugenics. Nothing is better for turning the average person into an avid supporter of eugenics than the incest debate. But if they have a child, it could have genetic defects. This argument has two flaws. Most importantly, sex doesn't mean children. I am surprised that anyone who doesn't understand that has the speech abilities to put a sentence together, let alone attempt to make an argument. Incest can exist without children being created by it. This feels so obvious that it shouldn't even need to be said. This alone completely invalidates this argument. Most interesting, however, is the open support of eugenics. This is the second great flaw of this argument, and something which is very fun to point out. Most people seem to consider eugenics to be reprehensible. As soon as incest comes up, however, they will immediately reach for the guide to human perfection through controlled breeding. Eugenics is the enemy, until it is of some use for constructing a desperate defense of one's emotional moral preferences, that is. While the incest debate is excellent for making people think about morality in rational ways, it also reveals the dejection-inducing idiocy of common moral sense. Almost every argument that comes up will be absolutely awful. Anyone with a shred of common sense, and a very basic familiarity with pro-gay arguments, should easily be able to not simply defeat, but obliterate the average supporter of incest being labelled an immorality. This is not to say homosexuality and incest are the same as issues. It is just to say that being issues of sex, consent, and morality, the arguments that come up in each case are very similar in a great many ways. Traditionally, I argued that incest was morally neutral. Why? Because I could see no rational reason for labelling it as immoral. I could see no good reason to call incest an immorality. Incest was simply not worth calling immoral. It was, in my view, morally neutral. This is a fairly defensible position. This is of course not to say all incest is morally neutral. Some incest is immoral, and some is morally neutral. The act itself, however, is not inherently immoral. That was my argument, and it stood strong. I argued with plenty of people, and they lost the debate literally every single time. Not one of them shook my reasoning. No topic was easier to win debates on. The desperate irrational arguments collapsed one after another, while mine stood firm. But they would not stand firm forever. I considered the issue in greater depth, and I concluded that there was in fact one strong argument for labelling incest as immoral. An argument which nobody had ever used against me, or ever has since. An argument that I have used with more success than any other anti-incest argument I have ever heard of. I call it the rigid rules argument. This argument concedes that in a void acts of incest aren't always immoral. But it points out that we are not in a void. Actions normalise themselves. Exceptions to moral rules against incest lead every incest-inclined being to believe they will be the exception. Sometimes there is a utility in just labelling a whole group of actions immoral, even when there are a few exceptions. Sometimes this is the rational thing to do. Sometimes this is worth doing. Strong, rigid moral rules prevent often immoral actions from being normalised by exceptions. Strong, rigid moral rules prevent people from thinking they will be the acceptable exception to the moral rule, when they will be anything but. Due to the presence of power imbalances, incest is very often immoral, and for this reason it is worth treating it as if it always is. The moment we say there are exceptions to the rule, people will try to be the exceptions, and in doing so they will engage in immorality. Sometimes rigid moral rules simply work better for discouraging harmful acts. One could argue that even entirely consensual incest with no weird power imbalances at play is still immoral because it normalises something that is normally immoral. The counter-argument is of course that people are smart enough to take these things on a case-by-case basis. People are smart enough to understand the difference between acceptable incest and immoral incest, and are capable of acting accordingly. Consensual incest, free from power imbalances, is fine because the only thing it normalises is consensual healthy relationships. One could argue that it is very dangerous to claim that a harmless act is normalising a harmful act via some kind of abstract conceptual association. As you can see, I haven't made up my mind on this. I think there are very strong arguments on both sides when it comes to the use of rigid moral rules. As you can see, in many regards this issue largely comes down to a very important moral question. What is more useful? A highly malleable and context-dependent case-by-case moral system, or a rigid rules-based system? Or something resembling a combination of the two? This is an important moral question that is of great significance to moral discourse concerning incest. It is something that is worth thinking about, not simply with regards to incest, but more broadly. Is a rigid system or a case-by-case system more useful, desirable, and rational? I think that some degree of rigidity can have great value. When we say that there are exceptions to every moral rule, immoral people will start thinking their actions are the exceptions to every moral rule. Sometimes rigid rules that label the occasional acceptable act as immoral are worth it. They prevent generally bad things from being normalized and justified. But they can also be needlessly sloppy, broad, and oppressive. Rigid approaches to morality can commit immorality themselves by labeling that which is acceptable as immoral. I think this issue is philosophically more difficult than many people realize. Hence my inconclusive thoughts on it. But I am sure of a few things. Incest is very often immoral due to power imbalances. Rigid moral rules can be good. Rigid moral rules can be bad. The incest debate gets people thinking about morality in rational ways, which is good. The incest debate reveals the complete idiocy of many people's moral reasoning. Those are the things that I know. As for the incest question itself, I have no solid answer. What do you think? Is it sometimes the case that there are equally rational arguments for both sides of an issue? Or are some arguments always more rational than others? I tend to think that one side always has to have some kind of rational advantage, some kind of claim to rational superiority. It is just a matter of figuring out what claim and what side. But perhaps I am mistaken. Let us consider it.